It started with a knock on a flimsy wooden door and ended, 24 years later, with the sound of keys turning in the lock, his lock. But on that day, in the spring of 1999, there was no victory in sight. Just a small, dim apartment, a single mother trying to keep it all together, and a landlord who had already made up his mind. He stood there, arms crossed, a crumpled eviction notice in hand. No warning. No explanation that made sense. She hadn't missed rent. She hadn't violated her lease. But she was black, single, and raising a boy on her own. In his eyes, that was 3 strikes too many. He told her it was nothing personal, but everything about it was personal, because it was about who she was, not what she'd done. She held her son close as she tried to stay calm. But even at just 6 years old, the boy could feel the storm in her chest, the way her hands shook while holding the keys that were no longer hers. He didn't understand the words eviction, displacement, or redlining. All he knew was that they had to leave, and they had nowhere to go. That night, as they sat in their car, her trying to act like it was a camping adventure, he asked quietly, "Mommy, are we poor people?" She didn't answer right away. Because how do you explain to a child that you're not poor because of money, but because of how the world sees you? What that landlord didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly predict, is that the same little boy he pushed out would spend the next 2 decades climbing through pain, climbing through poverty, climbing through a system never built for him to succeed. And eventually that boy would come back, not to seek revenge, but to reclaim something far greater. He would buy the entire building. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about transformation, about how brokenness can become a blueprint, how pain can fuel purpose, and how sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to someone who tried to keep you down is rise anyway. What happened in the years between that eviction and the purchase? That's the story no one talks about. The cold nights sleeping in shelters, the after-school jobs, the racism at job interviews, the quiet moments when he almost gave up, the people who opened small doors when big ones slammed shut, and maybe most important of all, the promise he whispered to himself under his breath every night. One day, no one will ever kick us out again. This is more than a personal triumph. It's a story about America, about housing inequality, about who gets to belong and who gets pushed out. It's about race, resilience, and rewriting your own narrative when the world hands you a broken one. You think you've heard stories like this before, but not like this, because this one has twists, and a mother whose strength is the foundation of every brick, a son whose silence became strategy, and a landlord who, decades later, would walk into a building he once owned, only to find out he's no longer welcome, not because of his skin color, but because this time the rules were different, and the boy he underestimated, he was the one writing them. Stay with us. You're going to want to see what happens next. The car they slept in that first night wasn't even theirs. It belonged to a friend who worked night shifts and let them borrow it just for a couple days. But a couple days turned into a couple weeks, and the spring breeze that once felt refreshing started to bite with a sharp chill. There was no bathroom, no shower, no privacy. Just a mother pretending everything was fine, and a boy trying to believe her. Every morning, she'd wipe the fog off the windshield and fix her son's collar in the reflection. She would kiss his forehead, straighten her back, and say with forced cheer, "Go shine, baby." He'd nod, gripping the lunch she'd scraped together from dollar store snacks and gas station fruit. She never let him see her cry. After dropping him at school, she'd spend hours in libraries and government buildings, filling out forms with tiny boxes and endless rejection. Shelter wait lists were long. Job interviews were rare. Even when she landed a cleaning job at a motel, the pay was barely enough to afford food, much less rent. "We're just between blessings," she would whisper to herself at night. But the world didn't see them as between blessings. The world saw them as disposable. They moved into a shelter months later. It was noisy, tense, and always crowded. She shared a bunk bed with her son in a room with 3 other families. She got used to the sound of strangers coughing in their sleep, children crying from nightmares, and staff yelling "lights out," like it was a prison ward. Her son, once bubbly and talkative, started to go quiet. He'd stare at the ceiling at night, asking questions she couldn't answer. Why do people think we're dirty? Why don't they like us? Are we gonna live here forever? She always answered with hope, but he could tell when her voice cracked. And one night, after she thought he was asleep, she whispered under her breath, "God, please just give him a shot, just one." The school he went to didn't help. Teachers assumed he was trouble because of where he lived. He was placed in remedial classes without evaluation. One substitute even accused him of stealing lunch because he asked for seconds. The other kids avoided him, teased him. Shelter boy, no address kid. But something strange started to happen. He didn't get angry, he got focused. He began showing up early to class, sitting front row, asking questions no one expected from a shelter kid. He'd read books under his blanket with a flashlight stolen from the dollar bin. Biographies mostly, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X. He saw a pattern in their pain, and it gave him a map. One day, a school counselor pulled him aside. She saw his quiet hunger and gave him a worn-out copy of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He devoured it in 2 nights. Then he read it again, this time with a pencil in hand, underlining, taking notes, thinking. From that day forward, his dreams shifted. No more wishing for toys, sneakers, or games. He wanted equity, ownership, a different kind of power. At the shelter, he started watching YouTube videos on real estate investing. He'd sneak into the computer lab and type, "How to buy property with no money," or "Investing while poor." Some nights, he'd talk his mom's ear off about multifamily units, FHA loans, or leverage, terms she didn't understand but loved hearing in his voice. She still worked late shifts, scrubbed toilets, folded sheets, and when she came home exhausted, he'd massage her feet while explaining the difference between assets and liabilities. "We're gonna get out of here," he'd say. "Not just out of this place, but out of this cycle." But the world didn't make it easy. There were eviction records that followed them, job applications that ended after one glance at their address, bank accounts that stayed empty, and moments, too many moments, where quitting would have been the easier choice. Like the time she was denied housing again because of credit history, and he caught her in the bathroom, sobbing into a towel. Or the time he failed a math test because he hadn't slept. He'd been up all night calming down a shelter roommate having a mental health episode. Or the night she came home with a black eye because a hotel guest got violent, and no one believed her story. But still, they kept going, because somewhere deep in both of them was a tiny ember. It didn't blaze, it didn't burn, but it refused to die. And even when everything fell apart, they told themselves it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else, something they couldn't see yet. Because sometimes rock bottom isn't just the lowest point, it's the solid ground you build on. And from that ground, this young boy would rise. Not overnight, not easily, but he would rise, and eventually he would come back to that building, to that street. And one day he'd walk through that door again, not as a tenant, but as the owner. It didn't happen overnight. There was no magical turning point, no lottery win, no miracle stranger swooping in to save them. What happened instead was slower, quieter, like a seed breaking through dry soil, unnoticed by anyone but the one who planted it. For most kids, dreams were toys or video games. For him, they were balance sheets, property taxes, passive income. While other boys bragged about sneakers or sports, he was dreaming of duplexes, fourplexes, multi-units, terms he barely understood but believed in with his whole chest. And it wasn't about money. It was about control, about security, about never feeling that hollow, helpless ache of watching your mother get pushed out of her own home again. At school, he was just another quiet black kid from the shelter, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. Teachers often assumed he wasn't paying attention, but he was. He listened to everything. And every subject, math, social studies, even science, he twisted into something useful for his goal. He started noticing patterns. Why some neighborhoods looked clean and safe while others, like the one their shelter was in, felt like they'd been forgotten. He learned that money didn't just change hands, it moved silently through systems. Systems that made it harder for people like his mom to ever get ahead. It made him angry at first, then determined. One Saturday at the library, he found a free flyer on the bulletin board. Youth Business Boot Camp for teens who think bigger. He was only 13, but he lied and said he was 14. It was held in a downtown community center, 4 buses away. His mom said she couldn't take off work, but he told her not to worry. He'd get there himself. He woke up at 5 a.m., packed 2 peanut butter sandwiches and made it. Alone, tired, but hungry not for food but for tools. And what he heard that day would stay with him forever. A local black entrepreneur, dressed sharp, with a voice like jazz and thunder, stood up and said, "You don't need to come from money to own money. What you need is knowledge, grit, and a reason that burns hot enough to make you do what most won't." That sentence was fire. It didn't just light something in him, it named what was already burning. After the seminar, he stayed behind to shake the man's hand. "I want to do what you do," he said. The man looked him over, surprised. He was small for his age. Skinny, his shoes were torn, but his eyes didn't blink. The man handed him a business card. "Read everything, show up hungry, and don't expect handouts." He did. He read everything. Watched hours of real estate videos. Took notes in a dollar store notebook until the pages curled and tore. He learned about house hacking, wholesaling, how to negotiate. He asked the librarian if he could help organize books in exchange for more computer time. She agreed and started sneaking him books she thought he might like. At the shelter, he started printing fake listings and analyzing them like real deals. He'd draw out floor plans and guess the rent. Every hallway became a mock tour. "See this unit?" He'd whisper to his mom in the stairwell. "I'd renovate this kitchen, knock down that wall, open concept." She laughed, but it wasn't mocking, it was admiration. Quiet, exhausted admiration. By 15, he got his first under-the-table job sweeping floors at a small property management company owned by a local black landlord. It wasn't glamorous, mopping stairwells, hauling trash, painting chipped fences. But he paid attention, took mental notes on everything, how leases were signed, how repairs were scheduled, how tenants were treated. He didn't just want to own buildings. He wanted to understand them. That landlord, Mr. Jenkins, became an unofficial mentor. One day, he caught the boy staying late after a shift, drawing numbers in a spiral notebook. "What you working on?" he asked. The boy looked up. "Trying to figure out cap rates," he said shyly. Jenkins chuckled. "Boy, you're 15. Why you know about cap rates?" "Because I can't afford not to." That was the moment Jenkins saw it. This wasn't a phase. This was purpose. So he started letting the boy sit in on Saturday meetings, listen in on calls with brokers. Sometimes he didn't understand the lingo, but he kept showing up. And when Jenkins offered him a beat-up copy of The Millionaire Real Estate Investor, he read it cover to cover, twice. At night back at the shelter, he'd tell his mom every detail, every strategy, every success story he heard. She was still scrubbing motel floors, still barely holding on, but now she had something else. A son who believed not just in dreams, but in execution. He was planting seeds in his mind every single day. And he knew, not hoped, knew they would grow. Not in a year, not even 10. But someday, those same keys that had been ripped from his mother's hand would return. And this time, they'd belong to him. By 16, he was no longer just a boy with a dream. He was a boy with a plan. Not a perfect one, not fully formed, but real enough to live by. The notebooks were piling up, each one thicker with numbers, scribbles, sketches, and timelines. He called them his future binders. To most people, they looked like messy school projects, but to him, they were blueprints for freedom. His routine was a rhythm of grind. School in the mornings, part-time work in the afternoons, sweeping floors, taking out trash, eventually learning to patch drywall and paint apartment units for a few property owners around the city. Nights were for studying, not just schoolwork but market research, real estate trends, credit systems, and loan hacks. He didn't scroll on his phone. He scrolled through Craigslist listings, trying to reverse engineer how deals were structured. He learned fast and failed faster. His first attempt at a side hustle was wholesaling. He thought he'd found a distressed seller willing to let go of a small duplex, and even got a local investor interested. But the deal fell apart when the seller got cold feet and backed out. No contract, no commission, nothing but a hard lesson. Interest isn't ownership. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Every setback was filed in his mental archive like data, something to be learned from, not feared. At 17, he took a bold step. He registered a sole proprietorship under his name, Vision Properties, LLC. It wasn't much. Just a business name on paper, no property, no capital. But it gave him an identity. He was no longer just that kid from the shelter. He was, in his mind, a future real estate developer. And that changed how he walked, how he talked, and how he saw himself. His first real break came in the form of trust, not capital. Mr. Jenkins, the seasoned landlord who had become a quiet mentor, handed him the keys to an old one-bedroom unit in a neglected building and said, "Clean it, prep it, list it. Let's see what you got." He poured everything into that unit. Scrubbed floors until they shone, repainted chipped walls, watched hours of staging videos, and even borrowed furniture from a neighbor just to stage the photos for the online listing. It rented in 3 days. Jenkins gave him another unit, then another. Before he was even 18, he was managing 6 units for Jenkins, handling tenant screenings, late rent calls, maintenance scheduling. The tenants didn't know he was still in high school. He answered emails between classes, wore slacks under his hoodie, and spent prom night reviewing lease clauses. But success never showed up in a straight line. There were nights when he broke down mentally, emotionally, physically. When a tenant flooded a bathroom and blamed him. When Jenkins lost his temper over a missed detail. When his own bank account had less than $50 and he still had to buy printer ink for applications and resumes. And then there was the pressure at home. His mom, proud but exhausted, still worked long hours and still lived with the guilt of not being able to give him more. She'd watch him typing late into the night, his eyes heavy, his shoulders tense, and she'd whisper, "Baby, you don't have to fix the whole world." But he'd always respond the same way. "I'm not trying to fix the world, Ma. I'm just trying to fix what it broke in us." By the time he graduated high school, he had no party, no trip, no gifts. But he had a plan. Work full-time with Jenkins, save every penny, improve his credit, and within 2 years make his first purchase. And then it happened. A tiny triplex came on the market, a probate sale, poorly marketed, structurally sound but cosmetically awful. The kind of property experienced investors overlooked because it wasn't worth the headache. But for him, it was everything. He ran the numbers. He knew it would cash flow if he lived in one unit and rented the other two. He applied for an FHA loan as a first-time home buyer. He brought in Jenkins as a silent co-signer. It was a tight deal, nearly fell through twice. But he negotiated like someone who'd been preparing for this moment since the day he was evicted. And finally, at age 20, he closed. He stood outside the building, keys cold in his hand, heart pounding, and looked up at the crooked gutters, the cracked walkway, the faded doorbell. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't big, but it was his first, the start of everything. What the world had once taken from his mother, he was beginning to reclaim, not through revenge, but through rebuilding. And as he turned that key for the first time, he didn't just open a door. He opened a new chapter. He hadn't been searching for it, but some places find their way back to you when the time is right. It was a gray morning, the kind that made the city feel quieter than usual, when he scrolled through a new batch of distressed property listings while sipping coffee at his desk. His eyes moved quickly, scanning square footage, zip codes, asking prices until they stopped. One address pulled him to a halt. He clicked the listing almost without breathing, and as the image loaded, his chest tightened. There it was, the building. Not one like it, not something close. The building. Same faded brick, same crooked staircase railing, same cracked pavement leading up to the door where his mother once stood begging for just a few more days. The description was blunt. Aging 6-unit walk-up, deferred maintenance, owner motivated to sell, cash buyers preferred. But it didn't need to say more. He knew every inch of that place like a scar on skin. For a moment he sat still, the cursor blinking on the screen like a pulse. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. He scheduled a private showing and returned 2 days later, alone, walking slowly toward the steps that once seemed taller than him. The building had aged, yes, but not more than he had. The iron gate still stuck when you pulled it. The hallway light still flickered. He walked through like a ghost, retracing his own footsteps, pausing at the second unit on the left, their unit, now occupied by someone else who had no idea what that space once held. He asked the agent questions, kept his voice neutral, all business. But inside, the past was loud. He didn't see peeling paint or water damage. He saw his mother clutching a rent receipt. He saw a child sitting on a milk crate wondering what they did wrong. But now the man standing there wasn't that boy. He was the buyer. He made an offer that night, all cash, no conditions, quick close. He wanted no delays, no risk of history slipping from his grip. And 2 weeks later, the papers were signed. Just like that, the building that once pushed them out now belonged to him. He didn't tell his mother right away. Not because he doubted the decision, but because he wanted the moment to be right. He wanted her to feel it, not just hear it. But fate wasn't done yet. A day after closing, he received a message from the seller's representative, the former owner, the same man who had evicted them decades ago, wanted to walk the building one last time. He didn't know who the new owner was. The name on the documents meant nothing to him. That was fine. He agreed to the meeting without hesitation. On the day they met, he dressed simply, jeans, clean sneakers, neutral hoodie. No suits. No pretense, just presence. He stood in the lobby, newly mopped, light bulbs already replaced, when the door creaked open. The man stepped in, older now. Gray hair, slower movements, but the same sharp, assessing eyes. He glanced at him quickly and asked, "You the new manager?" "No," he said calmly. "I'm the owner." The man paused, clearly thrown off. His eyes narrowed slightly, confusion giving way to a long, uncomfortable silence. Then came the flicker of recognition. His face changed, not dramatically, but enough to know he remembered. "You used to live here," he said, not as a question, but a fact he couldn't take back. Yes, the younger man replied. A long time ago. There was no heat in his voice, no gloating, just truth. The old man looked around, slower now. He nodded once, perhaps unsure of what to say. He didn't offer an apology. Maybe he didn't think he owed one. Maybe he didn't know how. It didn't matter. That moment wasn't about the past. It was about who held the keys now. After the man left without a word, he stood alone in the middle of the hallway. Everything was quiet. No yelling, no fear. Just stillness. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and turned them over in his hand. Heavy, metallic, and warm. That evening, he called his mother. She answered with the same tired but loving voice that had carried him through everything. "Do you remember that old building?" he asked. "The one we got evicted from." She hesitated. "Of course I do." He smiled. "It's ours now." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of her breath catching, soft and shaky. She didn't say anything at first, but he didn't need her to. That silence said everything. She remembered. She had never forgotten. And now, the place that once brought her to her knees was in the hands of the boy who had stood beside her, quietly taking it all in. But this time, they were not being pushed out. They were walking in together, heads high. Owning the building was never just about the bricks, the roof, or the paperwork. It was about what it symbolized, what it used to be, and what it could now become. After the purchase was finalized and the old landlord disappeared back into whatever past he came from, the building was quiet for the first time in years. But the silence wasn't emptiness. It was potential. It was space, space to do something different, something better. He didn't move into the building himself. That wasn't the plan. Instead, he kept living modestly in the small two-bedroom duplex he had purchased earlier on the edge of town. The building on Jefferson Avenue, though, that was sacred ground. That was memory turned into mission, and it was time to rebuild it from the inside out. He spent the first 2 weeks walking every inch of the property, clipboard in hand, making note of everything that needed care. Flickering hallway lights, uneven flooring, broken mailboxes, plumbing issues no one had touched in years. The old landlord had let the building rot because he never saw it as a home. He saw it as a number on a balance sheet. But the new owner saw more. Every crack in the wall was a conversation that had never been listened to. Every leaking pipe was a missed opportunity to care. Every broken fixture was a message. You don't matter. And that, he decided, would change. He brought in contractors he trusted, small, local crews, many of whom were Black, Latino, or from immigrant families trying to get steady work. He paid them fairly, fed them lunch on long days, and listened when they made suggestions. They didn't just fix things, they revived the building. New paint, clean lines, sealed windows, safety lights installed on every floor, and security cameras, not to spy but to protect. He added laundry machines that actually worked, installed a small mailbox nook with community info and events, even painted a mural in the entryway, a mother and child holding hands under a rising sun. But it wasn't just about the building. It was about the people in it. He reviewed every tenant's lease, not to hike rent, but to understand who lived there and what they were facing. Most were long-time residents barely holding on. A single mother with 3 jobs, a retired veteran on disability, a young couple working night shifts to make ends meet. Some were behind on rent, living in fear of notices on the door. But instead of threats, they got letters. Real letters. From the new owner. The letter was short, typed simply on white paper and signed with his full name. It read, "This building is under new ownership. I want you to know that I see you, I respect you, and I believe everyone deserves a safe, affordable place to live. I am not here to displace you. I am here to build with you. If you're behind on rent, come talk to me. If your unit needs repairs, come talk to me. We're not just tenants and a landlord, we're neighbors. And this building will rise, because we will rise together. Some tenants thought it was a trick, others cried. One elderly woman knocked on his temporary office door 2 days later just to say, "I've lived here 26 years and no one has ever said that to me." He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. He couldn't erase every hardship, but what he could offer, consistency, communication, dignity, he gave without hesitation. He hosted monthly tenant meetings in the lobby, brought in local nonprofits to provide rental assistance education, job resources, and childcare support. He partnered with a nearby food bank to leave fresh produce boxes in the hallway every weekend. The building slowly began to change, not just in how it looked, but in how it felt. There was laughter in the stairwells again. Children played outside without being shushed. Doors were left slightly ajar because for once people didn't feel like they had to hide. But perhaps the most transformative moment came the day he brought his mother to visit. He hadn't told her he had done all this. She knew he owned the building, but she hadn't seen what he had done with it. He picked her up on a Saturday morning, said only, "I want to show you something." She didn't ask questions. She trusted him the way only a mother could. When they arrived, she stepped out of the car slowly, staring at the building like it was a ghost. He offered his hand. She took it. They walked up the steps, now even, clean, with fresh black railing and flowers in small pots by the door. When she stepped inside, she stopped. Her eyes scanned the freshly painted walls, the bright mural in the entryway, the hallway that used to smell of damp and despair, now clean and calm. "This isn't the same building," she whispered. "No," he said, "it's not." He took her to Unit 2B, the very apartment they had once been forced to leave. The door opened to polished floors, sunlight through new blinds, and silence that didn't feel empty. "It's vacant," he said, "but I kept it just like this. I want you to choose what to do with it." She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "You turned our worst memory into something beautiful." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. In that moment, everything made sense. Not just the pain, not just the years of work, but the purpose behind all of it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about healing. About showing that when people are given a real chance, not charity but respect, they don't just survive, they build. And as he stood there beside the woman who once cried in the front seat of a borrowed car, unsure where they would sleep next, he knew one thing for certain. The cycle had ended here, right now. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a world that tried to erase you is simply to return and rebuild, better, stronger, and kinder than anyone ever expected. He never set out to be a symbol. He wasn't chasing headlines or trying to prove anything to the world. In fact, most of what he built happened quietly. One lease, one repaired faucet, one conversation at a time. But sometimes the quietest journeys speak the loudest truths. His story wasn't about real estate. It was about dignity, about what happens when someone who once had nothing, not shelter, not stability, not even the comfort of being seen, chooses not only to rise but to lift others with him. The building on Jefferson Avenue became more than just a property. It became a living memory, transformed. A place that once echoed with fear now hummed with laughter, light, and purpose. And in that transformation, it taught him, and everyone around him, what real power looks like. Real power isn't control, it's care. It's walking into the very space where you were broken and choosing not to break others. It's seeing the system for what it is, and still deciding to build something better inside it. That was the legacy he was crafting. Not in steel or stone, but in the way tenants no longer feared eviction notices taped to their doors. In the way his mother smiled without tension in her jaw for the first time in decades. In the way Young boys on that block began to ask him questions about credit, about business, about how he did it. And he answered them, every one, patiently. Because if someone had answered his questions when he was 6, maybe they wouldn't have slept in a car. Maybe his mother wouldn't have had to carry that silence like armor. So now he paid it forward, not out of guilt, but out of understanding, out of empathy born from experience. He started hosting free Saturday workshops at the local rec center, taught budgeting, renting, how to read a lease. Not flashy, just facts, tools, hope. Because that's what this was always about, not forgetting. Not forgetting what it felt like to be unseen. Not forgetting that every eviction has a face, a family, a future it may disrupt. And most of all, not forgetting that the most radical thing a person can do when they get power is use it to protect the very people the system overlooks. The message wasn't just about him. It was about them. The mothers holding it together. The boys who sit quietly watching everything. The ones who get overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. The message was simple and clear. You are not broken. You are being built. And one day, you'll return to the places that made you feel small. Only this time, you'll stand tall. So no, he didn't build a legacy in the traditional sense. He didn't build empires. He built something harder, trust. He didn't leave behind skyscrapers. He left behind something taller, belief. Belief that healing is possible. That justice doesn't always look like punishment. That sometimes the greatest victory is not in taking back what was lost, but in giving forward what was never given. And that's how cycles break. That's how stories end and begin again.